The kidnapper stuffs 9-year-old Jeannette into a cardboard box, slams the trunk. Her mother's screams fade behind the car. 3 days later, she's handcuffed in a dark bedroom. Her captor just said on the phone he's going to dispose of her body tonight. But Jeannette isn't crying. She's staring at a pizza box, and she's remembering something from CSI, something about evidence, something that's about to save her life. She reaches for that box and starts memorizing details like a detective, phone numbers, addresses, turn-by-turn directions. She's 9 years old, and she's building the case that will put her kidnapper away for 102 years. But here's what makes this impossible. She doesn't just escape. She leads police directly back to the house, from memory, after being stuffed in a box with a bag over her head. This is the story of how a 9-year-old Jeannette used the skills she got from watching true crime TV show to escape from her captor. The pizza box sits on the floor of the small, dark bedroom. 9-year-old Jeannette Tamayo stares at it like it's a lifeline, because in 3 hours her kidnapper told her he's going to dispose of her body. She heard him say those exact words on his cell phone. Not let her go, not drop her off, dispose of her body. She's been handcuffed in this room for 3 days. She's been assaulted. She's been threatened with a screwdriver, a knife, a pillow pressed over her face. And now, as she looks at that Little Caesars pepperoni pizza box, something clicks in her mind. A memory from watching CSI with her older brother, a technique she saw on television. She realizes that if she's going to survive this nightmare, she needs to become her own detective. She reaches for the pizza box, and in that moment, this 9-year-old girl makes a decision that will save her life and put a predator behind bars for over a century. But here's what makes this case different from any abduction case you've ever heard. While police searched desperately with over 150 officers combing Silicon Valley, while her parents prayed and the media broadcast her photo across California, Jeannette wasn't just surviving. She was gathering evidence. She was memorizing phone numbers. She was mapping every turn in her mind. She was building the case that would lead to her own rescue. And the technique she used to convince her captor to let her go, it was something she learned from a crime show. This isn't just a story about a kidnapping. It's a masterclass in how a child's intelligence and composure under the most terrifying circumstances imaginable can outsmart a violent predator. And what you're about to discover will change how you think about what children are capable of when their survival depends on it. Welcome to the story of Jeannette Tamayo, the 9-year-old who became her own detective, her own negotiator, and ultimately her own rescuer. This is the case that left veteran investigators speechless, that made national news anchors choke up on air, and that still today teaches law enforcement agencies about victim survival strategies. And there's a detail in this case that most coverage has completely missed, something that explains exactly how this predator found Jeannette in the first place, a connection so close to home it will make your blood run cold. I've spent weeks researching this case, going through court documents, police reports, trial transcripts, and witness testimonies. What I'm about to share with you is the complete story, told with the level of detail and respect that Jeannette's courage deserves. And if you're already thinking this sounds different from typical true crime coverage, you're right, because this case demands more than sensationalism. It demands we understand exactly how a child with no training, no weapons, and no help managed to survive against odds that experts say should have killed her within hours. Before we dive deeper, I need you to do something. Drop a comment right now with your theory. Could you have kept that level of composure at 9 years old? Do you think you could have done what Jeannette did? I read every single comment, and the most insightful theory gets pinned. Now, to understand how Jeannette ended up in that room, facing death and somehow finding the strength to fight back, we need to go back to June 6, 2003, in San Jose, California, where a normal Friday afternoon was about to become every parent's worst nightmare.
But someone had been watching her. On that Friday afternoon in early June, Jeannette stepped off the school bus and walked toward her house like she'd done hundreds of times before. She had no idea that a man had been parked outside her home for nearly 2 hours, waiting specifically for her. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's security camera would later show this chilling timeline. The man arrived at 1:45 in the afternoon and sat in his car, watching the house. He knew when she would be home. He knew she would arrive before her mother and brother. He had planned this. When Jeannette reached her front door, she noticed something immediately wrong. The screen door was slightly open. Inside her bedroom, she found broken glass scattered across the floor. Her window had been smashed. She tried to call her mother, but the phone line had been cut. Before she could process what was happening, a man appeared at her door. He was asking questions, peering into the home. Despite her growing fear, Jeannette opened the door. That split-second decision, made by a 9-year-old child who had been taught to be polite to adults, would change her life forever. The man forced his way inside. He grabbed her. Within moments, he had assaulted her and bound her hands with handcuffs and rope. Jeannette's world had just collapsed into terror, but her nightmare was only beginning, because at that moment, she heard the sound she'd been desperately hoping for. Her mother and brother were home. 15-year-old Paul arrived with their mother Maria and immediately sensed something was catastrophically wrong. The garage door was partially raised. He could hear his sister's voice and it sounded panicked. Paul made a decision that showed remarkable bravery. He crawled under the garage door to help his sister. When he saw the man holding Jeannette, Paul grabbed a screwdriver from a nearby counter and charged at the intruder, despite being completely outmatched in size and strength. The teenager fought with everything he had, screaming for his sister to run. Maria, hearing the commotion, rushed in and joined the fight, trying desperately to pull her daughter away from this stranger. What happened next was sheer brutality. The intruder grabbed a frying pan and began beating Maria viciously. He struck her repeatedly in the face and head until she collapsed, blood covering the floor. Paul continued fighting, but he too was beaten down. The man was laughing. Witnesses would later describe hearing screams coming from the house, sounds so horrific that neighbors froze, unsure whether to believe what they were hearing. One neighbor reached for her phone to call 911, then convinced herself it must just be a television playing too loudly. That moment of hesitation, that single decision not to make the call, may have cost Jeannette 3 additional days of captivity. The attacker dragged Jeannette to his car, stuffed her into a cardboard box in the back seat, and slammed the trunk closed. As he drove away, Jeannette managed one glimpse through a crack in the box. She saw her mother, bloodied and injured, running after the car. She saw her brother signaling desperately for help, and then they were gone, disappearing behind her as the car accelerated down the street. She was 9 years old. She was handcuffed. She was in a box, and she had no idea if her family was alive or dead. But here's what nobody knew at that moment. Not her family, not the police who would soon arrive at the blood-soaked crime scene, not even the man driving that car. Jeannette was already planning her survival. Even as terror consumed her, even as she struggled to breathe in that cramped box, her mind was working. She began counting turns. Left, right, straight, another left. She was creating a mental map of where he was taking her. That decision, made in the first moments of her abduction, would become the key to her rescue. Maria Tamayo was rushed to the hospital with severe injuries. Paul was treated for his wounds. But the moment Maria could speak, she told police everything she remembered. Her description of the attacker, his approximate age, his build, the fact that he'd said something chilling during the attack. He told her, "You know what I want." Those words suggested this wasn't random. This man had targeted Jeannette specifically. But why? What could a 9-year-old girl possibly have done to attract the attention of a violent predator? San Jose police mobilized immediately. Deputy Chief Rob Davis led the investigation, coordinating with over 150 officers who fanned out across the South Bay area. They had Maria and Paul's testimonies. They had the neighbors' surveillance footage, which confirmed the suspect's car and he'd been lying in wait. They had a timeline. They knew exactly when it happened and approximately what the suspect looked like. But they didn't have the one thing they desperately needed. They didn't have his identity. They didn't know his name, where he lived, or why he'd taken Jeannette. And with every passing hour, statistics told them the grim truth. If an abductor intends to kill their victim, it usually happens within the first 3 hours.
Hour 1 passed, then hour 6, then 12. Volunteers blanketed the neighborhood with flyers showing Jeannette's smiling face. News helicopters circled overhead. The story dominated local broadcasts. Jeannette's family gathered, praying, begging anyone with information to come forward. Her father, Pablo Velasquez, spoke to reporters in Spanish, his voice breaking. The community rallied. But as Friday turned into Saturday, and Saturday into Sunday, hope began to fade. 72 hours is the critical window. After that, the likelihood of finding an abducted child alive drops dramatically. The cases everyone remembers, the Elizabeth Smarts and J.C. Dugards who survived long-term abductions, represent a tiny fraction of a percent of these crimes. Most stereotypical kidnappings end in death, and they end quickly. But while the community mourned what they feared was already a tragedy, Jeannette was fighting. She was fighting in a way no one could have predicted. The man who took her was David Montiel Cruz, a 24-year-old with a prior conviction for auto theft but no sex crimes on his record. He used multiple aliases, sometimes calling himself Enrique Sosa Alvarez, a tactic that made him harder for authorities to track. Cruz lived with his girlfriend and her twin 11-year-old daughters in a home less than a mile from the Tamayo family's house. And here's the connection that explains how he knew Jeannette. Those twin girls had attended the same school as Jeannette. At some point, Jeannette had played at their house, interacting with those girls, never knowing that their mother's boyfriend was watching her, studying her, deciding that she would be his victim. When Cruz brought Jeannette to his house that Friday afternoon, he took her to a second-floor bedroom and handcuffed her. He told her that if she screamed, he would kill her. Then he sexually assaulted her. For 3 days, Jeannette endured repeated assaults, threats, and psychological torture. He threatened her with a knife. He pressed a pillow over her face until she couldn't breathe. He told her in explicit terms what he planned to do with her body. He was escalating, and Jeannette knew with the clarity that sometimes comes in life-or-death situations that she was running out of time. Prosecutors would later explain that Cruz likely planned to murder Jeannette. The threats weren't just intimidation, they were preparation. He was working up to it, the way violent offenders often do, building psychological justification for an act they know is irreversible. But Cruz made several critical mistakes. The first was underestimating his victim. Santa Clara County Deputy District Attorney Matt Breaker, who would prosecute the case, later said something profound about Jeannette's strategy. He explained that killers often dehumanize their victims. They create psychological distance that makes murder possible. But Jeannette did something that probably saved her life. She talked to Cruz. She told him about herself, about her family, about her dreams for the future, about wanting to be a veterinarian someday. She made herself real to him, not just an object, but a person with hopes and people who loved her. Every interaction, every conversation was Jeannette fighting to remain human in her captor's eyes. But Jeannette did something else, something that showed tactical brilliance that would impress investigators. She watched Cruz. She studied him. She memorized details. When he made phone calls, she listened to every word, memorized his cell phone number. When he let her watch television, she absorbed information about the house, the neighborhood, anything that might help police find her. And when Cruz ordered a pizza from Little Caesars on the third day of her captivity, Jeannette saw an opportunity. She remembered something from CSI, from one of those episodes she'd watched curled up on the couch with her brother. Crime scene investigators could find evidence anywhere, even on something as simple as a pizza box. They could lift fingerprints, trace orders, connect locations. So when that pepperoni pizza arrived, Jeannette didn't just see food, she saw evidence. She made a mental note of everything: the restaurant, the type of pizza, the box itself. She was building a case against her captor while she was still her prisoner. But Jeannette needed to do more than gather evidence. She needed to get out alive. And that's when she implemented the most brilliant part of her survival plan. She faked a medical emergency.
Jeannette told Cruz that she had asthma and a rare disease. She said she needed medicine or she would die. She coughed, wheezed, made herself appear sicker and sicker. She convinced him that if he didn't let her get her medication, she would die in that bedroom, and her body would be discovered, and he would face murder charges. It's unclear whether Cruz believed her or whether he was simply tired of the complications Jeannette represented. He'd already been interrupted by her family's unexpected arrival during the abduction. There had been violence, witnesses, blood everywhere. The case was all over the news. Maybe he realized he was in over his head. Maybe Jeannette's strategy of humanizing herself had worked. Maybe her fake illness gave him an excuse to let her go without admitting to himself what he'd really done. On Sunday evening, June 8, 2003, 72 hours after Jeannette was taken, Cruz made a decision. He put her in his car and drove to East Palo Alto. He dropped her off at a street corner in front of a liquor store and drove away. Jeannette, traumatized, terrified, shaken to her core, walked into that convenience store and asked for help. The store employee immediately called police. Officers arrived within minutes and found Jeannette alive but deeply traumatized. She was taken to a hospital for medical evaluation and treatment. When detectives gently asked if she could tell them anything about where she'd been held or who had taken her, they expected what they usually get from child victims: fragmented memories, confusion, terror too overwhelming to form coherent thoughts. What they got instead left them speechless. Jeannette told them everything. She recited the kidnapper's cell phone number from memory. She told them about the Little Caesars pepperoni pizza. She described the house, the second-floor bedroom, the surrounding neighborhood. And then she did something that veteran investigators still talk about. She took them on a drive and directed them, turn by turn, back to the house where she'd been held captive. She remembered every single turn Cruz had made 3 days earlier when she was handcuffed in a box in the back seat of his car. Left, right, straight, another left. She'd memorized the route while fighting for her life, and now she was leading police directly to her abductor. At 2 a.m. on Monday, June 9th, a SWAT team surrounded the house where Cruz was staying. They found him preparing to flee. When officers entered, Cruz tried to hide in the attic. He fought when they attempted to arrest him, forcing officers to use a police dog. He was bitten and briefly hospitalized before being booked into custody. When police searched the house, they found the bedroom where Jeannette had been held. They found physical evidence confirming sexual assault. They found everything Jeannette had described. Her testimony was precise, detailed, and completely accurate. Deputy Chief Rob Davis told reporters that Jeannette had done everything right. He said that if you're ever caught in a situation like that, you need to keep your wits, be aware of your surroundings, and humanize yourself so the captor sees you as a person. But his voice caught when he said it, because everyone understood they were talking about a 9-year-old child who shouldn't have needed those survival skills in the first place. The arrest of David Montiel Cruz brought relief and rage in equal measure. Relief that Jeannette was alive and that her captor was in custody. Rage at what had been done to a child, at the violence inflicted on her family, at the trauma that would scar all of them forever. But for prosecutors, the arrest was just the beginning. Now they had to prove in court what Cruz had done, and for that, they needed Jeannette's testimony.
Carl Beatty's defense strategy centered on Cruz's mental capacity. He argued that Cruz tested at a mentally disabled level, that he suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from physical and emotional abuse as a child, and that he was incapable of understanding right from wrong. Prosecution psychiatrists confirmed that Cruz did have PTSD and cognitive limitations, but prosecutors argued that Cruz's actions showed clear premeditation. He had waited outside Jeannette's house for 2 hours. He had planned the abduction. He had cut the phone line. He had brought handcuffs. These weren't the actions of someone who didn't understand what he was doing. These were the calculated moves of a predator who knew exactly what he wanted and how to get it. The jury deliberated and returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts. Every single felony charge was sustained. The courtroom erupted with emotion. Jeannette's family embraced each other, tears streaming down their faces. Paul, now 16, smiled broadly and said his whole family was happy, especially his sister. But the trial wasn't over. There was still sentencing. On Friday, January 7, 2005, Santa Clara County Superior Court Judge Renee Navarro prepared to decide David Montiel Cruz's fate. Jeannette wasn't present in the courtroom, but her words were. Prosecutor Matt Breaker read her victim impact statement aloud. In it, Jeannette wrote that she would feel safer if Cruz was put in jail for all his life, or as she put it, for eternity. Judge Navarro, a veteran jurist with 18 years on the bench, said something that silenced the courtroom. He said that in all his years as a judge, he had never encountered a crime as vicious as what Cruz had done. Never. In nearly 2 decades of seeing the worst humanity has to offer, this case stood out as uniquely horrific. Then he delivered the sentence: 102 years in prison. Cruz would be eligible for parole when he was over 120 years old, meaning he would almost certainly die behind bars. The sentence sent a clear message. What Cruz did to Jeannette, to her family, to the community, would not be tolerated. There would be no second chance, no early release, no mercy. Judge Navarro also recommended that prison officials provide psychiatric treatment for Cruz, acknowledging his mental health issues while making clear they didn't excuse his crimes. But even with Cruz behind bars, the damage lingered. Prosecutor Breaker told reporters that Jeannette was doing well, but that her life was forever changed. She couldn't sleep in her bedroom without an adult present. She got scared when the doorbell rang or when someone knocked on the door. She couldn't play on the school playground unless an adult was nearby. The trauma had stolen her sense of safety, her ability to feel secure in the world. And those wounds would take years, perhaps a lifetime, to heal. David Montiel Cruz is currently incarcerated at California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo. His release date is listed as unknown, but based on his sentence, he will almost certainly never leave prison alive. He has not granted interviews. He has not shown remorse. Records indicate he has filed no appeals that have gained traction. For all practical purposes, the case is closed. But cases like this never really close, do they? They continue in the nightmares of victims, in the vigilance of parents, in the changed protocols of law enforcement agencies. The Jeannette Tamayo case became a teaching tool. Police departments across the country now use her story to educate the public about survival strategies during abductions. Experts point to several things Jeannette did that likely saved her life. She stayed calm enough to think strategically. She humanized herself to her captor. She gathered evidence. She memorized crucial details. She faked a medical emergency to convince her captor to release her. And when she was freed, she immediately helped police build their case. Every single action showed presence of mind that most adults would struggle to maintain.
But there's a darker lesson here, too. Cruz had access to Jeannette because of her friendship with his girlfriend's daughters. He met her in a context that seemed safe and normal. He wasn't a stranger lurking in an alley. He was connected to people she knew. This is how most child predators operate. They're not the creepy strangers parents warn their children about. They're the trusted coach, the family friend, the parent of a classmate, the boyfriend who lives in the house where your child plays. They use proximity and trust as weapons. There's another uncomfortable truth this case forces us to confront. Jeannette survived because she was extraordinary. She possessed intelligence, composure, and tactical thinking that saved her life. But what about the children who don't have those qualities? What about the kids who freeze in terror, who can't think strategically, who don't happen to remember techniques from crime television? They deserve to survive too. Their lives have value too. We cannot place the burden of survival on child victims. The burden must be on adults to create systems and safeguards that prevent these abductions in the first place. And that brings us to the question that haunts everyone familiar with this case. Could this have been prevented? The surveillance footage showed Cruz waiting outside Jeannette's house for nearly 2 hours. Neighbors saw his car, but didn't think it was suspicious. One neighbor heard screaming, but convinced herself it was probably just a television. If she had called 911 immediately, would Jeannette have been spared 3 days of torture? We'll never know. But it's a reminder that see something, say something isn't just a slogan. It's a life-saving principle. Cruz had no prior sex crimes on his record before he abducted Jeannette. His only conviction was for auto theft. He wasn't on any registry. There was no way for Jeannette's family to know he was dangerous. He was just the boyfriend of a woman whose daughters went to the same school. That's how close monsters can get to our children while we remain completely unaware. The investigation itself revealed something else troubling. Police had leads. They had witness testimony. They had surveillance footage. They had a description, but they didn't have Cruz's identity. And without that, all the evidence in the world didn't matter. It was Jeannette herself who provided the breakthrough, the Little Caesars pizza order that led police to the address. What if she hadn't thought to memorize that detail? What if Cruz had decided not to order food? The case might still be unsolved. The fact that a 9-year-old victim provided the crucial evidence that led to her captor's arrest is both inspiring and deeply disturbing. It shouldn't have been her responsibility, but she took it on anyway because she wanted to live and because she wanted justice. Today, Jeannette Tamayo is an adult. She has chosen, understandably, to live her life privately. She gave interviews in the years following her rescue, appearing on shows like Oprah and contributing to documentaries that examined her case. She wanted her story told because she believed it could help others. She wanted children and parents to know that survival is possible, that fighting back is possible, that using your mind as a weapon is possible. But she also deserves peace, privacy, and the chance to build a life that isn't defined solely by the worst thing that ever happened to her. The broader context of this case matters too. According to government statistics, only about 0.04% of missing children are victims of stereotypical kidnappings, the kind where they're abducted by strangers and held captive for extended periods. That's a tiny fraction. Most missing children are runaways or victims of family abductions. But that tiny fraction represents real children, real families, real trauma. Jeannette was one of that 0.04%. She beat the odds by surviving, but thousands of others in that category don't. Their cases end with recovered bodies, grieving families, and predators who rob the world of children who should have lived full, long, beautiful lives. This case forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about how we protect children, about what happens when our systems fail, about the randomness of violence and the unequal distribution of survival. Jeannette survived partly because she was brilliant, but also partly because Cruz made mistakes, because he decided to order pizza, because he believed her fake illness, because something in him hesitated at the final moment when he could have killed her. Other children who were just as deserving of life didn't get those lucky breaks. Other families didn't get their miracle. That's not fair. It's not just, but it's reality.
What we can do, what we must do, is learn from cases like this. We can teach our children about body autonomy and trusting their instincts. We can pay attention to the adults who have access to our kids. We can call 911 when something feels wrong, even if we're not sure. We can support trauma survivors instead of stigmatizing them. We can demand that our justice system takes crimes against children seriously, with sentences that reflect the severity of the harm. And we can remember that behind every true crime case is a real person whose life matters, whose trauma is real, whose survival is a victory we should celebrate while never forgetting the cost. Jeannette Tamayo showed us what courage looks like. She showed us that children are capable of extraordinary things when their survival depends on it. She showed us that intelligence and composure can be weapons as powerful as any physical strength. And she showed us that justice is possible, even in the darkest circumstances, when victims refuse to give up and when systems work the way they're supposed to. But the real question isn't whether Jeannette was exceptional, because she absolutely was. The real question is why a 9-year-old child needed to be exceptional just to survive something that never should have happened to her in the first place. That's the question we still need to answer. If you made it this far, you've just experienced a level of detail and investigation that most coverage of this case completely misses. I release a new deep dive true crime documentary like this one every week, and next week's case is even more complex. It involves a killer who operated for over a decade, law enforcement failures that let them continue, and a piece of evidence that was hiding in plain sight the entire time. You're not going to want to miss it. But before you go, I need to know what you think. Drop your theory in the comments. Do you believe Jeannette's strategy of humanizing herself is what really saved her, or was it the fake illness that convinced Cruz to release her? Could you have maintained that level of composure at 9 years old? What would you have done differently? I read every single comment, and the most insightful gets pinned and featured. If you want to be here when next week's investigation drops, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. This kind of research takes weeks, and I only do it for people who actually care about getting the full story, the real details, and the respect these cases deserve. And if this case fascinated you, you need to watch my investigation into the Elizabeth Shove case, about a 14-year-old who was held captive in an underground bunker and used a text message to engineer her own rescue. That video is linked on your screen right now. Jeannette Tamayo survived. Her captor will die in prison. Justice was served, but the scars remain, and the lessons of this case should stay with us. Because somewhere right now, another child is in danger, another predator is planning. And maybe, just maybe, if we pay attention, if we act when something feels wrong, if we create systems that actually protect children instead of just reacting after they're harmed, we can prevent the next Jeannette from ever needing to become her own detective just to survive. Thank you for watching. Stay safe. And remember, the most dangerous monsters don't look like monsters at all. They look like everyone else, until they don't.